please, please, please stop creating terrible webinars. I'm Paula Williams.
And I'm John Williams.
And we are ABCI, and ABCI's mission is
to help all you folks out there in the world sell more of your products and services. The aviation world, that is.
Exactly. And doing terrible webinars is not going to help you.
No, stopping them will.
Well, you got to do something besides terrible webinars. But so today we're going to talk about why there are so many terrible webinars.
And what to do about it.
And what to do about it and what to do instead. So three things, one, not every topic is worthy of a webinar. If it's a good topic for your audience, make sure it's worth their time. And 3, you want to put some structure, some storytelling, and some substance into that webinar. So let's dig in.
And never give a bad webinar again.
And never give a bad webinar again. So during the pandemic, webinars kind of went nuts. And I actually like webinars because you can learn a lot about an in-depth topic without having to go anywhere. You can often see it after the fact. They're often recorded and they're put on people's websites after the fact.
Well, you can learn something about it given that they're constructed and presented properly.
Yeah, so there's lots of good reasons to do webinars. But I think, just the fact that they became so ubiquitous, a lot of people started doing them whether they should be or not, right?
True.
And, their goal was to produce content. And I totally get that because there's a lot of marketing gurus out there, the Gary Vaynerchuks of the world and others who say, produce content, produce content, produce content. It doesn't matter what the quality is, just do it, And then there's the Grant Cardones of the world who are saying activity, 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 activity. Forget quality, just activity, activity. That's not what he says. I'm exaggerating, but the emphasis is definitely on doing something rather than doing nothing, and I totally get that. Doing something is better than doing nothing, provided that it is not terrible, right?
Well, you can't wait around to have something perfect to do, but by the same token, you don't want to be creating something at the D level when you need something at least at the B level.
Right. And I don't want to scare anybody who is interested in doing a webinar away from doing them because they definitely are worthwhile and they definitely can be very constructive and they can sell a lot of products. A lot of people are very, very good at doing webinars and they sell a lot of products because they have a product or service that really is conducive to a lot of education. So I don't want to stop anybody from doing something that's working, but I do want to stop people from doing things that aren't working and things that are terrible and the things that are doing them more harm than good.
Right.
Okay. So the first thing that I want to mention is that not every topic is worthy of a webinar. Some topics are better suited to an article or even an infographic. If it's something that's really simple that you can get across in 30 seconds or less, then for God's sake,
don't spend 30 minutes on it.
Don't spend 30 minutes or 60 minutes on a topic that can be conveyed that quickly. And I'll tell you, there are a lot of webinars that are out there where they say something that is useful and it's great information, and then they say it again.
And again.
They say it again.
And again.
And they twist it a little bit and say it another way, and then they say it again, and then they take questions on it, and then they say it again. You get the idea.
Repetition's good, but you can overdo it.
Oh, yeah. That's for sure. Aviation customers are, and prospects are smarter than the average bear. They do get things pretty quickly, and you really do need to provide an hour's worth of material if you're asking for an hour's worth of somebody's time.
Exactly.
So, the level of resentment, I think, if you waste somebody's time with an infographic is pretty small, right? They just scroll past it. They're not mad at you or anything else. There's no hard feelings. And they just say, okay, I already knew that. Or, that's interesting. Let's, carry on.
But if you waste their hour.
Yeah, if you write an article that has good subtitles in it and people start reading it and they go, okay, I get the point, moving on. They're still not going to resent you for wasting their time with an article that has information they already know. But if you get somebody to schedule an hour with you, which is a high bar to begin with, Everybody's really busy these days, and spending an hour with you and making that commitment to block that time out of their calendar, they have some pretty high expectations, and you darn well better meet them. With an hour's worth of material, or at least 45 minutes worth of material, and some Q&A, or whatever you're going to do, right? Okay. So, how do you do that?
With great vigor and skill.
I think one of the worst things that people do, and I had this conversation with a client recently about, a webinar that he'd been to, and said that he wished he could have his hour back. And, a lot of times people will do these forums where they do like maybe 4 different topics and have 4 different speakers or more. And that not everybody in the audience is
interested in all 4.
Exactly. So, if you're going to have a forum, that's great, but make sure that the topic is relevant to every single person in your audience. And make sure that the title and the promise of your webinar is something that is relevant to every single person that shows up.
Yep.
So if I show up to John's webinar that is going to be about, what would you do a webinar about?
Oh, a fuel control on a turbine engine.
Okay, that is something that is super specific. I have questions about it. I will come to that webinar. If I don't care about turbine fuel controllers on turbine engines, which is the case, I'm not coming to your webinar. But still, I'm not going to resent you for pitching a webinar to me that I'm not going to go to, right?
Right.
Exactly. So, make sure that you make a super specific promise and that you meet that promise.
But if you, as I say, the webinar is going to talk about business practices and it ends up talking about fuel controls for turbines, that's not a good thing.
Right. So, okay. So first thing is, you want to make sure that the topic is worthy of a webinar. Number 2, make sure that it is a good topic for your audience and that you are advertising it correctly so that the people that show up and commit an hour to this webinar are going to get what they expect. Thing number 3 is how the webinar is structured. And what you don't want to do is what we talked about at the beginning, where you spill your candy at the beginning of the webinar and say, here's a bunch of cool and interesting facts. And now we're going to restate those facts. And now we're going to give an example. And now we're going to restate those facts again. And, you're just throwing around the same pile of candy that you spilled out. You really want to make sure that you've got structure, you've got storytelling, you've got substance, and you've got next steps in your webinar in that order. You want to tell them what you're going to tell them, make that promise. If you stick with me for an hour, you're going to walk out of here with
these 5 things that you know.
Exactly. And then you want to make sure that your storytelling is good. You don't want to spill your candy in the lobby, right? And give them all the good stuff up front. You want to make sure that they understand how this is relevant and why this is relevant, and give some good real world examples of, here's a person that had this happen, and some really good storytelling. And you can learn storytelling from a lot of people these days. There's a lot of really good ones.
Background information from why what you're saying is relevant.
Exactly. And then you want to provide the substance now that you've provided the context. So now that they know why they need to know these things, here's what they need to know. And you deliver on that promise that you made at the beginning, right?
Yep.
Okay. And then next steps. What do you want them to do now that you've had this conversation?
And that they now know what you know.
And they now know what you know. So what do they need to do next, assuming that the topic of your webinar was a good one? And, most of us do webinars because we're trying to sell a product or service, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, some of us give webinars out of the goodness of our hearts, or because we want to do some good in the community, or because we see something going on that we think is terrible and it needs to stop, like terrible, terrible, terrible webinars. But, and next steps is perfectly appropriate. If you want to do a great webinar, schedule an office hour with us. If you are a current client, let's plan out your webinar. If you are not a current client,
why not
become a current client, right? So that's your next steps. This is how you improve your webinars going forward, is by taking a next step that usually involves a sale, in this case, and many others. But either way, they're leaving that webinar with good information.
Right.
You're leaving this podcast episode, which is so far 9 minutes and 45 seconds, with some good information. And, you'll never give a bad webinar again if you only follow those 3 guidelines, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So never give a bad webinar again. The industry
We'll appreciate it.
and John and I well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Have a great week.
Talk to you later. Bye.